So as the UAW strike grinds on and we've finally gotten through the political theater that was the president going to stand on the line and say a few words, I have found that I don't support the UAW in their demands. And I've been quiet about this, but the more I look, the more I realize that if the big three give in to the UAW, they are setting themselves up for what I truly believe will be the most catastrophic failure of the American automobile sector. Welcome back to All Cars, y'all. I am John, and this is going to be a long one. I'll put in a couple of timestamps. The first part of this video, I'm going to talk about the UAW, my opinion of them, my feelings on them, a little bit of the history, because that sets up the framework for the issues that they're fighting for right now and why I think they're legitimately dangerous and why I think it could be catastrophic in the near future. So if you want to skip my history of the UAW and my feelings on it, you can just get straight to the issues, but I encourage you to listen. So I wanted to support them, and in fact, I've been very quiet about the strike for over a week now. I kind of supported them at the beginning, but the more I started to look into it, the more I started to research the UAW, the history of the automobile manufacturers, what they're actually asking for, the more the hairs on the back of my neck started to stand up, because history is repeating itself. So I have mixed opinions about the UAW overall. In full transparency, if you can't tell from my accent, I live in the American South, and we're not heavily unionized down here. I have given it a lot of thought. I think I know 3 people who are actually in a union. I'm sure it's more, but it doesn't come up in polite conversation. And most of my opinion of the UAW in the past has always been negative. I did another video some time ago about when Shawn Fain was elected UAW president and his rhetoric of calling the GM, Ford, and Stellantis, I will continue to call them the big three, as the enemy. So you're calling your employers the enemy. But as I've gotten older and I've read more, certainly from like that book right there, Call Me Roger, the UAW and the workers have been blamed over and over and over again in history for everything that possibly befalls the auto manufacturing in America. And it turns out that they have more often than not been part of the solution as well. And so it seems very much to be we're going to push it and then we've got to give concessions and be part of the solution. And so I have to say, I have a modestly positive opinion of the UAW. If you look back in history, the UAW was actually founded by communists. Now, that is not hyperbole by me. You can actually go to the UAW site and see in their archives they were founded by communists. And that gives me the heebie-jeebies, because communism is directly opposite of a free republic based on the rights of man. And you can still look at the UAW site and see, let's say, communistic words and slogans kind of sprinkled throughout it. But there's no denying the UAW did amazing, transformational, and very important work, certainly in the early 20th century, when they started to finally form in the 1930s, 1940s, and get recognized. They transformed American auto manufacturing in terms of protecting workers' rights and improving their safety. These were abhorrent conditions that they were working in, and the UAW helped improve that. So we can't take that away from them. But through that, they also continued to push for more and more and more and more. The UAW demands are separated from the demands of a global marketplace. And so if we fast forward to the 70s and the 80s, people like Roger Smith here blame the UAW endlessly for every problem that America was having. That the UAW was paid too much relative to the Japanese, which ignored the fact that the Japanese had better benefits. For example, the plants were closing, Americans were losing market share to the imports, and the UAW had to keep giving concessions. But as the economy improved, they began making bigger and bigger demands. And those demands ultimately set up the situation that we had in about 2008 with the Great Recession, where GM and Chrysler both declared bankruptcy and Ford was relatively close as well. And the UAW had to give up massive concessions to save the automakers and save the chance of them having any job at all. And that's super, super important to consider, that the UAW demands had to be scaled back to save the automakers, because the global competitive market has not gotten easier in the 15 years since that's occurred. And so that kind of leads us to, what are the issues? Now, make no mistake, the presidency of the UAW is a political position. It's not a political appointee. It's voted by the UAW members. And there's about 350,000 UAW members, something like that. Shawn Fain won by 500 votes. Just 500. And his platform was being tough on the automakers. Finally being tough that the previous leadership of the UAW was too in bed with the automakers. And that's fired up a lot of UAW members. So make no mistake, this strike was going to occur. It had to happen because he promised it, because he had to be tough. And so they sent a list of pie in the sky, moon pie in the sky demands. And short of GM, Ford, and Stellantis signing off on everything, if they disagreed with anything, he had to have the strike, simply to fulfill his promises to his members and all the rhetoric that is associated with it. For example, they're working for poverty wages. And then when President Biden said he was going to visit, but it was going to be on a Tuesday, which means we had 5 more days of strike, there was no way the UAW would ever agree to anything until the president had a chance to show up and make his appearance, because it's all political theater. And I will give Fain credit. While my previous video I talked about him calling their employers the enemy, he has handled it brilliantly and done a fantastic job in the media of every time they ask for something, no matter how unreasonable, as soon as it's turned down, he gets on the news and he starts doing interviews and spews his rhetoric. And it has affected the overall opinion of people in America. Studies are showing that the majority of people are backing the workers on this. In fact, I personally have talked to people who do not follow the auto industry like I do, and they're like, hey, what's up with the UAW strike? And so that's why I was looking at it. That's why I wanted to kind of stay out of it and the politics of it, but increasingly it has bothered me. So the issues at hand, keep in mind, when the UAW began this negotiation, they had about 1,000 demands. Now, most of those I think were very, very easy to solve. I don't know what they involved in new locks on the bathroom doors or whatever it happened to be. So I think when the strike started, fully we'd gotten down to about 80% solved. But that left the big ones. And some of the big ones are this. Number one, the jobs board. And what this is, I don't know if they're looking to have it reinstituted or expanded, but imagine this. You work in a factory and the models you build are selling a little slowly. So they need to stop the line or slow the line down, and you get temporarily laid off. What this means is that you go home, sit on the couch, and make 95% of your normal wage anyway. It's job security, it's income security, but it doesn't benefit the competitiveness of the manufacturers. Consider that during the 80s especially and into the 90s, the U.S. auto manufacturers, and there's plenty of blame to go around here, I'm trying to be fair, they had some underwhelming models, some underwhelming offerings out there, and they had some that sold relatively slowly. But instead of sending their workers home, they kept the line going because they'd have to pay the salaries anyway, the wages. And what that meant was they had all of these Chevy Corsicas and things like that, that they had to dramatically discount or push off into rental fleets, which hurt the resale value of GM cars. There was a point where American auto manufacturers were selling for $2,500 less than a Japanese car. And part of that was they just had to keep the lines moving, so they generated some kind of income to actually pay the workers. That was scaled back or removed in the 2008 Great Recession, but they want it reinstituted. The second would be a defined benefit pension. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with the terms or not, but a pension is defined benefit. If you work at a certain wage for a certain amount of time and retire, you are going to get a certain pension every single month from the company. Now, the majority of American business has moved away from this because it is absolutely catastrophic if there's ever a downturn. It's like a Ponzi scheme. If the company is always growing, always improving, always hiring, always more and more profitable, they can afford to pay these defined benefit plans. But once there's a downturn, and certainly you think about GM losing market share from the 70s through the 90s, it becomes burdensome to the point of driving companies into bankruptcy, and they want out from under it. So during that 2008 bankruptcy of GM and others, they negotiated a defined contribution, which is what we would see as a 401k, where you can put a portion of your money into an investment and the company puts in an amount too, and it's invested. You don't know exactly what you're getting at the end. It all kind of depends on a bunch of other things, but the investments are under your control. GM gives 6.4% matching. That's astonishing. The best I've seen has been 4%. I asked my wife about it this weekend. Her company matches 4%. 6.4 is unbelievably generous. But the UAW is complaining about it because they want the company to magically be able to pay all of their benefits no matter what. Next up would be the tier system. And this has been a big one. Eliminate tiers. And what this is that during the Great Recession, with the bankruptcy of the big three, or two of the big three, they instituted a tier system. So you might earn $32, $35, $36, whatever it is up here, but there's an entry-level tier of about $17.50, something along those lines. And you had to vest into that top-level tier. And originally it was 8 years, and now it's, I believe, 4 years. Ford, I believe, and Stellantis have offered 90 days now to vest into the top tier, and the UAW wants it to go away entirely. No vesting. You get hired, you make the wage. Well, there's two important things to note here. The first is I will leave part of this discussion to within the UAW. I believe in seniority, and I believe if you're doing a job and you work there longer, you should earn more. I would not be comfortable if I was working on the line and I was screwing in the lug nuts on tires, right? And you hired some guy straight out of high school and he suddenly is making exactly as much as me, and I've been there for 10 or 15 years, I would have a problem with that. But that's a UAW internal discussion, honestly. That's the solidarity and equal pay for equal work. But the other side of it is the reason those tiers came about was because the American auto manufacturers needed to be more competitive with the non-unionized factories here in America. Now, the average employees at Ford, GM, and Stellantis earn somewhere in that $70,000, $74,000, $78,000 a year. Quick search on Google, you can see that at American Honda, they make substantially less. In fact, less than that first tier that the UAW has allowed. So they want to eliminate the tier and move everybody into the highest pay, which would be nearly 3 times as much as other manufacturing in America from Honda, Toyota, Hyundai are actually paying. So they had a tier system put in place to make the American auto manufacturers competitive even within our own country, and the UAW wants to eliminate that. Meanwhile, their workers, the average is making something in the neighborhood of $70,000 to $74,000 a year, and Shawn Fain is out there saying that they're working for, quote, poverty wages. We have to remember that this is a global, and this is a big one here. The pay is a big one, and the tiers are a big one. We are in a global environment. And so those unionized workers up in the north part of America are competing with non-unionized workers in the southern part of America, broadly speaking. Now, those southern workers are not being unionized. Why is that? Well, because they're happy and they're being treated well. They don't need a union to create problems to solve every 4 years. Now, that you might think that's unfair. But we're also competing with Mexico. It's part of NAFTA, and Ross Perot was right back in the day saying that if they passed NAFTA,
there will be a giant sucking sound going south.
There would be a giant sucking sound of American manufacturing moving down there. And he was absolutely correct. Even Shawn Fain said that something like 65 different factories have been closed in America. Well, because it's got to be outsourced. In fact, I've done a quick look at Ford and GM and what unionized factories, assembly factories, they have in America. And if you look at the products, by and large, they are the largest, most expensive, highest profit margin vehicles the companies make. Because that's the only way they can be competitive, is on the upper end of what they actually sell. Now, there's a few outliers like the Chevy Bolt, for example, or maybe the Transit. But overall, the most affordable stuff can't support union wages. So it has to be outsourced somewhere, whether it's Mexico or whether it's South Korea. Now, part of this research for me made me think, what about Germany? Germany is a more democratic socialist state, strong union involvement, high wages, very expensive. And there's been a lot in Europe of outsourcing over to Eastern Europe where it's less expensive. But I went and looked, and if this is accurate, a manufacturing worker in Germany makes, on average, 30,000 euro. That's about twice what a UAW member makes. So our UAW, our unionized factories up in Ann Arbor, are twice as expensive as Germany, which is considered to be expensive. So it's ridiculous. They're disconnected from the global supply chain. And that's where this all boils down to for me. I'm desperately afraid right now that the UAW has the advantage. And they've done a brilliant job. I will give Fain credit for this. He's done a brilliant job of addressing public opinion, being on Twitter, and this strike of being able to close down one location that affects multiple other locations. It's absolutely brilliant how it's been handled. And what they're asking for, whether it's that jobs board, whether it's that defined benefit pension plan, whether it's wages and the elimination of the tiers, those are rolling back to a previous glorious moment in their history. That same moment that put such a burden on the big three that when the downturn happened, they declared bankruptcy. Their dream is to drag the automotive manufacturers back to a point where their business model was literally unsustainable. And that leads me to the final one, which was the 40% raise they're asking for. So their argument is based on lies. They say that the CEOs have made 40% pay increases, so should the workers. Of course, that's an an outright lie. Now, they dropped it down to 36%. However, there's multiple different things here. First off, there's very few people in the world who can run a global multi-billion-dollar manufacturing company like General Motors or Stellantis. There's several hundred. But there's millions of people who could work on an assembly line. So it's not a one-to-one comparison, the value you bring to the business. Now, do I think that the CEOs of Ford, GM, and Stellantis are overpaid? Absolutely. But at least let's be honest about what we're saying here. And specifically, if you look at like Mary Barra with GM, her base pay, it's only like $1.72 million, something like that. That was Farley. That was Farley from Ford. A lot of money. There's no doubt about it. And the majority of his is performance bonuses and stock grants and things like that. But also consider these CEOs, part of their compensation that is lumped in with all this is benefits such as using the company jet. It's not money in their hands. It's not money in their pocket. And none of them have had a 40% raise. Now, Mary Barra came the closest with, I think it was 36, something like that, if you count the bonuses on top of it. But specifically, if you look at Tavares over here with Stellantis, he actually makes less than the previous guy did. Okay? So if you're going to compare salary to hourly wage over here for your worker, at least be honest about it. It's not the 360% difference. It's absolutely not. And if you're going to sit over here and say, oh, well, look, they're benefiting from all the billions of dollars that the manufacturers are making, you know what? So are you. UAW members are getting bonuses. Oh, guess what? They don't include that in discussions of poverty level wages. They ignore the $9,000 or $14,000 bonuses they've been getting. So do I think CEOs are overpaid? Absolutely. But unfortunately, right now, the UAW workers are arguing for an increase, and we're somewhere in the 20, 21, 22%, I think, is what we're seeing right now from Ford, with an immediate like 10 or 12%, and then a certain percent every year after there. They want an increase in their wages at a time when they're already paid 2 to 3 times more than other people in the country. They're already paid 2 times more than what auto manufacturing in Germany is being paid. And they're being paid about 10 times more than what a skilled auto worker in Mexico is being paid. And you might want to dismiss, oh, it's Mexican built, right? Well, they've been building down there for over 20 years. They know what they're doing. There's very little perceived difference between the quality of what comes out of Mexico versus what comes out of Ann Arbor, Michigan. You can make that argument about maybe certain parts of South Korea. But my point is the UAW is pricing themselves out of the market while at the same time arguing that we need not close factories. We need to keep them. So we need to keep the factory to pay their wages on only the most expensive vehicles. They're also arguing for job protections for the move to EVs. I think that's legitimate as well. But they are disconnected from the global supply chain and the pricing that comes with it. And the problem I have is this, very, very simply. If they get everything they want, when the next downturn occurs, and there will be a downturn, there was always a downturn. There's always going to be a recession around the corner some point. It's going to devastate Ford and General Motors. The only thing that might possibly keep them afloat will be their overseas factories. So for all of this, for all of the political theater and for all of the positive news that is not doing their research into what brought us historically to this moment, I see if Ford, GM, and Stellantis agree to the demands of the UAW, it is going to be catastrophic. Because I just don't see the 3 the big three, surviving the next recession or depression, using bankruptcy to stay largely intact with these kind of deals. Let me know your thoughts below, guys. Thanks for being here.